The dinner rush was in full swing at the bustling restaurant. The sound of clinking silverware, the hum of conversations, and the sizzle of dishes being prepared in the kitchen created a symphony of chaos. Among the servers darting between tables was a young waiter, confident to the point of cockiness. He had only been working here for a few weeks, but he carried himself as if he owned the place. His sharp tongue and quick wit made him popular with some co-workers, but not everyone appreciated his sense of humor, especially when it came at someone else's expense. That evening, a couple walked in and caught his eye. The woman was dressed elegantly, exuding an air of quiet confidence, while her companion, a man in his mid-50s, seemed more reserved but warm. They didn't appear particularly flashy, just well put together, as if they belonged in a place like this. The couple was seated at a corner table, and their soft laughter and easy conversation added to the lively atmosphere. The waiter, noticing their understated demeanor, assumed they were just another pair of ordinary diners. He sauntered over to take their order, flashing his signature smirk. At first, everything seemed normal. They were polite, thanking him for his recommendations and placing their orders without any fuss. But something about the woman caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the subtle way she glanced around the restaurant, as if she knew every detail. While the couple waited for their food, the waiter returned to the kitchen, cracking jokes with his co-workers. That's when he started making offhand comments about the guests. His tone was teasing but bordered on rude, suggesting the woman looked a little too uptight and the man like he was out of her league. A few of his coworkers chuckled nervously, but most stayed quiet, sensing that his words were edging into dangerous territory. The waiter, emboldened by the lack of outright objections, decided to take his act to the floor. When he returned to their table, his professionalism slipped. He made a few sarcastic remarks, subtle enough to fly under the radar of the unsuspecting diners but sharp enough to amuse himself. The couple didn't seem to react, at least not outwardly, but the woman's eyes grew sharper, her polite smile never faltering. As the meal progressed, the tension began to build. The man remained kind, even complimentary, when the waiter returned to check on them. It seemed almost as if he were giving the young server a chance to redeem himself, a chance to correct his course before things went too far. But the waiter, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't pick up on the cues. Instead, he doubled down, adding more unnecessary comments about the restaurant's regulars and hinting that some people came in pretending to be more important than they were. What the waiter didn't know was that this couple wasn't just any pair of diners. They weren't there by accident. And every word he spoke, every smirk he gave, was digging him deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of. By the time dessert was served, the woman finally decided to speak up. Her voice was calm, even pleasant, as she asked the waiter a seemingly innocent question: "How long have you been working here?" What happened next would change the young waiter's perspective on everything and serve as a lesson he'd never forget. Stay tuned to find out how this seemingly ordinary evening took a turn that left everyone in the restaurant stunned. You won't want to miss this moment of instant karma that unfolded in the most unexpected way. Let me know if you'd like to refine or expand this further. The waiter paused for a moment, caught off guard by the woman's question. It was so straightforward, yet there was something about the way she asked it that felt deliberate. He tilted his head slightly, flashing a confident grin. "Oh, long enough to know my way around here," he replied, his tone as casual as ever. "Why do you ask? Thinking about applying?" He chuckled at his own joke, but the woman didn't laugh. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the restaurant before returning to him. "It's a nice place," she said simply, her voice steady. "You must enjoy working here." The waiter shrugged. "It's all right. Pays the bills, you know? Could be worse, could be better." He noticed the man glancing at him, a faint smile on his face. There was something about the way the couple was looking at him, like they were studying him, almost waiting for something. But the waiter brushed it off. He had more tables to get to, And besides, these two didn't seem like the type to cause any trouble. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of unease. Something about the interaction lingered in his mind. But he quickly shook it off and returned to his usual routine, making jokes with other customers and chatting with coworkers. Back at their table, the couple continued their meal, their conversation now quieter, almost private. The woman leaned in slightly, whispering something to the man. He nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. From a distance, they still appeared like any other couple enjoying an evening out, but there was an undeniable shift in the air around them, subtle, yet palpable. In the kitchen, the waiter leaned against the counter, recounting the conversation to one of his coworkers. "She was asking me how long I've been working here," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I think she was trying to size me up or something." "What's with people like that?" His coworker, an older server who had been with the restaurant for years, gave him a wary look. "You might want to watch what you say," she warned softly. "You never know who's sitting out there." The waiter waved her off. "Relax. They're just a couple of regulars. Besides, if they were someone important, don't you think they'd have made a bigger deal about it by now?" The older server didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said she wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, the couple finished their main course and sat back, seemingly content. The woman glanced toward the kitchen, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the man. They exchanged a few more words, their voices too low for anyone to hear. Whatever they were discussing, it seemed to be building towards something. When the waiter returned to clear their plates, the man spoke up for the first time. His voice was calm and friendly. "You've got a lot of energy," he said, smiling. "That's not easy to keep up in a place like this." The waiter, taken slightly off guard by the comment, laughed. "Well, it keeps things interesting. Gotta keep moving or the shift drags, you know?" The man nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. But it must be challenging, dealing with all kinds of people." The waiter shrugged. "It has its moments. But you get used to it. People are predictable." The woman raised an eyebrow at that, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Predictable, huh? That's an interesting way to put it." The waiter, emboldened by the exchange, leaned in slightly. "I mean, you see enough people come through here, you start to notice patterns. The way they talk, the way they act. You can usually tell what kind of night it's going to be within the first 5 minutes." The woman nodded slowly, her smile never wavering. "And what kind of night do you think this is?" For a split second, the waiter hesitated. There was something in her tone, something subtle but deliberate. But he quickly recovered, flashing another grin. "A busy one," he quipped. The couple exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, before the man spoke again. "Well, it's always good to stay on your toes. You never know when something unexpected might happen." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the waiter felt a flicker of unease again. But before he could dwell on it, the man thanked him for his service and asked for the check. As the waiter walked back to the register, he couldn't help but feel a strange tension building. It wasn't anything obvious, there had been no raised voices, no complaints, nothing to suggest trouble. But something about the couple's calm demeanor, their quiet confidence, unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. In the corner of the dining room, the couple waited patiently, their expressions relaxed but alert. The woman tapped her fingers lightly on the table, her eyes fixed on the kitchen door. The man leaned back in his chair, his posture easy but deliberate. The waiter returned with their check, placing it on the table with a smile. "No rush," he said. "Take your time." The woman glanced at the bill, then at the waiter. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but firm. She handed the check to the man, who reached for his wallet without hesitation. As they settled their payment, the woman looked up at the waiter one last time. "It's been an interesting evening," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something the waiter couldn't quite place. He nodded, unsure of how to respond. I'm glad you enjoyed it, he said awkwardly. The couple stood, gathering their belongings. The man placed a generous tip on the table, then turned to the waiter with a small smile. Take care, he said simply, his tone friendly but firm. As they walked out the door, the waiter watched them go, a strange feeling settling over him. He couldn't shake the sense that something important had just happened, something he couldn't quite put into words. Back in the kitchen, the older server approached him again, her expression serious. You sure you know who they were? She asked quietly. The waiter frowned, confused. What do you mean? She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. You'll find out soon enough, she said, walking away. The words echoed in his mind as he finished his shift. That lingering tension, that strange feeling he couldn't shake, followed him all the way home. What he didn't realize was that the events of this night were far from over. The consequences of his actions, the seemingly harmless comments he'd made, were about to catch up with him in ways he never could have imagined. And when they did, the lesson would be one he'd never forget. The next day, the waiter arrived at work feeling as confident as ever. The previous evening's strange interaction with the couple lingered in his mind for a moment, but he dismissed it as overthinking. People came and went from the restaurant all the time, it wasn't worth dwelling on. He told himself it was just another night, another pair of customers he'd never see again. The restaurant was busier than usual that evening. The staff hustled between tables, balancing trays piled high with dishes and managing an impatient crowd of diners. The waiter thrived in the chaos, weaving through the bustling floor with practiced ease, cracking jokes and flashing smiles that earned him occasional laughs or eye rolls. It was a typical night, or so he thought. As he moved between tables, he noticed small, unusual things. The manager, who usually stayed in the office handling paperwork, was walking around the dining room more than usual, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharp focus. A few other employees exchanged hushed whispers near the bar, glancing toward the entrance. The air felt heavier than normal, though no one had said anything outright. The waiter didn't think much of it until the moment the front door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was the man from the previous night, and he wasn't alone this time. Two other men accompanied him, both sharply dressed, their postures commanding attention without a word. The man's presence was calm yet powerful, as though the entire room shifted to accommodate him. The waiter's chest tightened, though he couldn't explain why. He felt a nervous energy he didn't recognize, but he quickly brushed it off. They're probably just here for another dinner, he thought to himself. No big deal. But when the manager immediately approached the man with a warm handshake and led him to a private table in the center of the room, it became clear this wasn't just another visit. The two men who had entered with him didn't sit, instead, they stood nearby, their eyes sweeping the restaurant. The other diners seemed to notice as well. Conversations grew quieter, movements more cautious, as though everyone sensed that something was happening, even if they didn't know what it was. The waiter found himself glancing toward the table more often than he intended. The man appeared relaxed, engaging in what seemed like a light-hearted conversation with the manager. But his presence was magnetic, and every time the waiter looked over, it felt as though the man's gaze was just a second away from meeting his own. Then, just when the waiter thought he might be in the clear, the manager beckoned him over. You're on this table tonight, the manager said in a low voice. The waiter froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He forced a smile, trying to mask his discomfort. Sure thing, he said, hoping his voice didn't betray his nerves. As he approached the table, the man looked up, his calm expression unreadable. The waiter plastered on his usual grin, though it felt forced. Good evening, he began, keeping his tone light. What can I get started for you tonight? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the waiter for a long moment, his gaze steady and unflinching. It wasn't hostile, but it was piercing, as though he could see straight through the facade. Finally, he smiled a small, subtle smile that carried more weight than the waiter was prepared for. I think we'll start with water, the man said simply. The waiter nodded quickly, retreating to fetch the drinks. His hands felt unsteady as he filled the glasses, and he cursed himself for letting his nerves show. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. "It's just another table." But when he returned, the tension only grew. The man thanked him politely, his tone calm and measured, but there was something else in his demeanor, an unspoken understanding that the waiter couldn't quite place. Throughout the meal, the man's interactions with the waiter remained cordial but deliberate. Every word felt weighted, every glance intentional. The waiter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, though he didn't know how or why. As the night wore on, the unease spread. A few other staff members whispered to each other behind the bar, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The older server who had warned the waiter the night before watched him closely, her gaze filled with silent disapproval. When the meal was nearly over, the man signaled for the waiter to approach. "You seem to know this place well," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "Tell me, what do you think makes a good restaurant?" The question caught the waiter off guard. He hesitated for a moment, searching for an answer that wouldn't seem out of place. I guess. Good food, good service, and a nice atmosphere," he said, trying to sound confident. The man nodded slowly, as though considering the response. "And what about the people?" he asked. "The ones who make it all happen?" The waiter shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Yeah, I mean, they're important too," he said cautiously. The man's gaze lingered on him, and for a moment, the waiter felt as though the entire restaurant had gone silent. Then, the man smiled again, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down the waiter's spine. "I think you're right," the man said. "People are the most important part of any business. The way they treat each other says everything about the kind of place it is." The waiter nodded quickly, not trusting himself to speak. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's interesting," he continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "You can learn a lot about someone by how they act when they think no one's paying attention." The words hit the waiter like a punch to the gut. He felt his face flush, though he tried to maintain his composure. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind," the man added, his tone polite but firm. The waiter nodded again, forcing a tight smile before retreating to the kitchen. His mind raced, replaying every interaction from the previous night. He felt exposed, as though every word he'd spoken, every smirk and joke, had been laid bare for judgment. In the corner of the dining room, the man finished his meal and stood, shaking hands with the manager once more. As he left, he glanced back toward the kitchen, his expression unreadable. The waiter watched from a distance, his stomach in knots. He didn't know who the man was or why he had come back, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The tension that had been building all evening had reached a breaking point, and the waiter could feel it in his bones. As the door closed behind the man, the waiter turned to the older server, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is he?" She hesitated, her expression a mix of pity and frustration. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, her tone quiet but firm. The words sent a chill down his spine. He knew she was right. Whatever was coming next, there was no escaping it. The waiter could only brace himself for the moment when everything he had tried to ignore would come crashing down. The waiter stood frozen, phone still in hand, replaying the woman's voice in his mind. "They know everything." The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them pressing down on him like a vice. He couldn't make sense of it. Who were they? What did they know? And why was she warning him? The questions circled endlessly, but no answers came. He sat down on the edge of his bed, his thoughts racing. The logical part of him screamed to let it go, to follow the warning and not show up for work tonight. But a stronger, more stubborn part of him refused to back down. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know why the couple had been watching him so intently, why the manager was acting strange, and why he was suddenly receiving cryptic threats. His gut told him there was something deeply wrong at the restaurant, something bigger than he could have imagined. The manager's behavior, the whispers among the staff, the presence of those two mysterious figures, it all felt connected somehow. He just didn't know how the pieces fit together. Later that afternoon, as he paced his apartment trying to decide what to do, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a coworker. "Manager wants to see you early tonight. Be here at 5. His stomach dropped. Was this related to the message he had received? He wanted to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't seen the text, but curiosity won out. Against his better judgment, he decided to go in. By the time he arrived at the restaurant, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The place seemed quieter than usual, the familiar hum of the early evening rush noticeably absent. He stepped inside, and immediately he felt that same heavy tension from the night before. The manager was waiting near the back of the dining room, speaking in hushed tones with someone the waiter didn't recognize. As the waiter approached, the manager straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "You're early," the manager said, his voice curt. "You told me to be here," the waiter replied, keeping his tone steady even though his nerves were on edge. The manager gestured for him to follow, leading him to the office in the back. Once inside, the manager closed the door and turned to face him, his demeanor shifting slightly. "There's something we need to discuss," the manager began, his tone low and deliberate. "You've been asking questions, haven't you?" The waiter's heart raced. He hadn't expected the confrontation to come so quickly, but he tried to play it cool. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, feigning ignorance. The manager narrowed his eyes. "Don't play games with me. I've seen the way you've been looking around, talking to people, watching things you shouldn't be watching. You need to understand something: this isn't a place for curiosity. You do your job, and that's it." The waiter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the door to the office burst open. Standing there was the man from the other night, his presence filling the small space. His expression was calm but firm, and his eyes locked onto the manager. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The manager stiffened, his composure faltering for the first time. He glanced at the waiter, then back at the man, clearly torn about how to proceed. "This isn't a good time," the manager said, but the man stepped further into the room, ignoring him. "It's the perfect time," the man replied, his gaze shifting to the waiter. "You should hear this too." The waiter felt his pulse quicken. Whatever was about to happen, he knew it was going to change everything. The man closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You've been hiding something," he said to the manager, his tone even but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And it's time to come clean." The manager's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the man cut him off. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice firm. "I've done my research. I know about the money. I know about the deals. And I know how you've been covering your tracks." The waiter's breath caught in his throat. Money? Deals? What was the man talking about? The manager's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his facade of control slipping further. "You have no proof," he said, his voice shaky. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the desk. "I don't need proof," he said. "I have everything I need right here." The manager stared at the folder, his face a mix of fear and anger. The waiter, caught in the middle of the escalating confrontation, could only watch in stunned silence. "This place was supposed to be something good," the man continued, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "A place where people could come together, where employees could thrive. But you've turned it into something else, something rotten. And now, it's time to face the consequences." The waiter's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The man's words were like puzzle pieces falling into place, revealing a picture he hadn't fully understood until now. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was part of something much bigger, something that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. As the man and the manager continued their tense standoff, the waiter realized he wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of this now, whether he wanted to be or not. And whatever came next, there was no turning back. Suddenly, the door to the office opened again, and the woman from the previous night stepped inside. Her expression was calm but determined, and she carried an air of authority that silenced the room. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "We know everything." The manager's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked defeated. But then his expression hardened, and he turned to the waiter. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Get out." The waiter hesitated, torn between the urge to leave and the need to stay. He looked to the man and the woman, hoping for guidance, but their expressions gave nothing away. "You should stay," the man said finally, his tone calm but firm. "You deserve to know the truth." And just like that, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension as the stakes were raised higher than ever. The waiter braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with anticipation. The manager's glare darted between the man and the woman, his face pale and tense. The waiter stood rooted to the spot, unsure whether to stay or bolt, but his curiosity and the strange, unavoidable pull of the moment kept him in place. "You don't understand what you're doing," the manager hissed, his voice low but desperate. "You have no idea what's at stake." The man didn't flinch. His steady demeanor remained unchanged as he leaned forward, his voice calm but razor sharp. "I know exactly what's at stake. You've been skimming off the top, funneling money from this place into illegal ventures, while everyone else, your staff, your customers, suffers for it. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about accountability." The waiter's heart raced as the pieces began falling into place. He had sensed something was wrong for weeks, the strange tension among the staff, the unexplainable changes in operations, and now it all made sense. The restaurant wasn't just a front for regular business. The manager had been using it to cover up something far darker. The manager's eyes darted to the woman, his tone shifting to a pleading edge. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. This isn't just about me, there are people involved who won't take kindly to this." The woman took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "We're not afraid of them. This stops here." The manager clenched his jaw, his hands trembling slightly as he turned back to the man. "If you push this any further, you'll regret it. You don't know the consequences." "I'm willing to take that risk," the man said firmly. "But you won't be the one dealing with them. We've already called the authorities. They'll be here any minute." The manager froze, his face twisting into an expression of panic. "You did what?" The man didn't answer, but the faint sound of sirens in the distance spoke volumes. The waiter's pulse quickened as he realized this wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of the end for the manager's scheme. But just as the tension reached its peak, the manager lunged toward the desk, grabbing the folder the man had brought in. He tore it open, scattering papers across the room, his movements frantic. "You think this is enough to take me down?" he shouted, his voice wild. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The woman stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Stop this. It's over. There's no way out for you now." The manager's breathing was heavy, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The sirens grew louder, and for a moment, it seemed like he might surrender. But then, in a final act of defiance, he turned to the waiter. "This is your fault," he spat, his voice venomous. "If you had just kept your head down, none of this would have happened." The waiter felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but before he could respond, the door burst open, and uniformed officers flooded into the room. The scene erupted into chaos as the manager was restrained, his protests echoing through the restaurant. As the officers led the manager away, the waiter stood in stunned silence, trying to process everything that had just happened. The man and the woman exchanged a glance, their expressions heavy with relief but also something else, an unspoken understanding that this was far from over. Before the waiter could speak, the man turned to him, his tones softening. "You did the right thing, even if it wasn't intentional. Sometimes, the smallest actions can set off the biggest changes." The woman nodded, her gaze meeting the waiter's. "This place will be better now. It can finally be what it was meant to be." The waiter opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he felt relief, guilt, or something in between. All he knew was that his life and the restaurant would never be the same. As the dust began to settle, the officers collected evidence, and the staff whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of the chaos. The man and the woman prepared to leave, their jobs seemingly done. But just as they reached the door, the woman turned back, her expression unreadable. "There's one more thing you should know," she said, her voice steady. "The people your manager was working with, they won't just go away. They'll want answers. Be careful who you trust." The waiter felt a chill run down his spine. The warning hung in the air like a storm cloud, a reminder that this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of something much bigger. As the couple disappeared into the night, the waiter stood alone in the dimly lit restaurant, the weight of their words settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: his simple, unassuming life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. He glanced around the empty dining room, the faint hum of the kitchen in the background. For a brief moment, he considered walking away, leaving the restaurant and its tangled web of secrets behind. But something inside him refused to let go. The waiter knew he had a choice to make: stay and face whatever came next, or walk away and leave it all behind. But deep down, he already knew the answer. The night might have ended with the manager's arrest, but the real story was just beginning. And as the waiter took a deep breath, he couldn't help but feel that his role in it all was far from over. The restaurant felt strangely quiet in the aftermath of the chaos. The waiter stood near the entrance, watching the taillights of the police cars fade into the distance. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on him, but underneath it all, there was a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and the manager, along with his secrets, was finally gone. The rest of the staff gathered in small groups, their hushed conversations filled with speculation and disbelief. For many, it felt like waking up from a bad dream. They had worked under the manager for years, some longer than others, and never imagined the person they saw every day was hiding so much. There was a strange mix of emotions in the air: anger, confusion, and even a bit of hope. The waiter found himself walking toward one of the servers he had become close to during his time there. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her voice soft but tinged with disbelief. "Did you know about all of this?" He shook his head slowly. "I had no idea. I mean, I knew something was off, but this? I never could have guessed." She sighed and crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter. "It's hard to believe. He always acted like he had everything under control, like he was invincible." The waiter nodded, her words resonating with him. For so long, the manager had carried himself with an air of authority, a confidence that made it hard to question him. But now, that facade was shattered, and the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. As the night wore on, the staff began to clean up the mess left behind. Broken glasses were swept away, tables were wiped down, and the lingering tensions slowly began to dissipate. It felt like a fresh start, even if no one was entirely sure what that meant yet. By the time the last table was cleared, the waiter found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where the manager had often barked orders. It was strange to think about how much power the man had held, how much control he had over everyone's lives. And now, he was just gone. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned to see the woman who had come with the mysterious man earlier. She stood in the doorway, her expression softer now, almost sympathetic. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The waiter shrugged, unsure how to respond. I didn't really do anything. You and whoever that guy was, you're the ones who exposed everything. She smiled faintly, stepping closer. Maybe. But you were the spark. Sometimes, all it takes is one person asking the right questions, paying attention to the little things. You were brave enough to do that, even when you didn't realize it. He wanted to argue, to tell her he wasn't brave, just curious or maybe even foolish. But something in her tone made him pause. She seemed genuine, and her words carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, considering his question. The restaurant will keep going. It'll take time to rebuild trust, to figure out what comes next. But with the manager gone, there's room for something better. Something honest. The waiter nodded, her words giving him a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. For all the chaos and uncertainty of the night, there was something reassuring about the idea of a fresh start. Before she left, she handed him a small card with a phone number on it. If you ever need anything, or if you notice something that doesn't feel right, call me. You've got good instincts. He took the card, slipping it into his pocket. Thanks, he said, though the word felt small compared to everything she had done. As the last of the staff trickled out, the waiter lingered for a moment, taking in the quiet of the restaurant. It was strange to think about how much had changed in just one night. The place felt different now, lighter, almost. The next day, news of the manager's arrest spread quickly. Customers who had once been regulars began trickling back in, curious to see what the restaurant would become without him. The staff, though still adjusting to the change, started working together in a way they hadn't before. There was a newfound sense of camaraderie, a feeling that they were all in this together. The waiter found himself stepping into a more active role, helping to organize shifts and brainstorm ways to improve the dining experience. He didn't have all the answers, but he was determined to make the most of the opportunity. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant underwent a quiet transformation. The old tensions and secrets that had once clouded the atmosphere began to fade, replaced by a sense of optimism. The staff worked harder, not out of fear, but because they genuinely wanted to see the place thrive. The mysterious man and woman never returned, though the waiter often thought about them. Their sudden appearance and departure felt almost surreal, like something out of a movie. But their impact was undeniable, and he couldn't help but feel grateful for whatever had brought them to the restaurant that night. Months later, as the restaurant buzzed with life on a busy Friday evening, the waiter paused for a moment, leaning against the counter to take it all in. The laughter of customers, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, it was a far cry from the tension and unease that had once defined the place. He smiled to himself, feeling a quiet sense of pride. Things weren't perfect, and there were still challenges to face, but the restaurant was on a better path now. And in some small way, he felt like he had been a part of that change. As he returned to his work, the waiter couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The experience had taught him a lot about courage, about integrity, and about the importance of speaking up when something didn't feel right. And though he didn't know what the future held, he was ready to face it, one step at a time.